Hi everyone. So today's video, I wanted to take a little more in-depth psychological analysis of Muhammad, right? Let's get to understand him, know him a little better, because I think once you have a little bit more of an understanding of his behavior, his mindset, his growing up, we can get a better sense of actually what he ends up saying, which is the Quran, his sayings, or his channeled self, or what is the self saying to him. As you all know, Muhammad was born an orphan. Yes, he was born in a pretty well-known tribe, but he himself, his mother and father, were not that well off. Was already an orphan by the time he was born, and by the time he was born to a young mother, Amina, his young mother, she widowed. You see that she does end up sending him away for breastfeeding. She doesn't even breastfeed her child, and she sends him away. A lot of narratives will be telling like that was a norm, that was a norm, and we'll come to that because we'll see how he actually raises his own children and how what he ends up doing. So at a young age, you can imagine this child. Yes, it's not unusual. People do go through hardships even in that era, in that 7th century Arabia. It is a harsh environment, but he is a poor relative essentially that is being sent away, and the people who take him also know that he is poor. And as you can imagine, the kind of environment, treatment, and sort of sense of how they actually interact with him, how do they speak to him, how do they see him, and how does he eventually sees himself, right? It does play an important role because now you understand as a child, you are born sort of unwanted, unloved, and poor. And the people who have taken you in also know that they are treating you well, but they kind of know that you're not like some big deal, right? Moving on forward, when Halima and her family that experienced that raising him, they do mention some unusual behaviors, right? Like, yeah, he also mentioned these weird stories. He does have some seizures. So we see all that when by the time he ends up returning to his mom, not very significant reunion, not much to say, not much to remember. There was really no bond. Like it's kind of a woman who was a stranger to him. He sees that woman, but there's really no sort of relationship or any sort of significant emotional attachment even to this mother figure who he suddenly, reunited with. We don't even see much of a father figure in his early years, like, as close father-son relationship guiding him, helping him. We don't really see any of that either. He does have some father figures later on in his life, which we will see how it ends up playing out. Like he probably was expecting a lot more from his uncle, his grandfather. He was expecting a lot more, maybe treatment or, love, acceptance. It doesn't seem like he had that kind of relationship. What you do end up seeing was that when you look at it from an outsider's perspective, you do a lot of favors for him. They did provide for him. They basically didn't let him, didn't leave him or leave him to die in the desert, or they did eventually provide for him, even though his mother could have raised him as her own. After all, he was her only child, her first child. Her husband's died, she's alone, but she doesn't even choose to keep him or nurse him, raise him, have that emotional connection with him. He doesn't, like, she doesn't even realize that he doesn't really have anyone. He doesn't have a father, and now she has also essentially deprived him of a mother. So you must take these things into account. Like any child today, would feel extreme abandonment, that my mother didn't want me, my father died, and it would. I think this will play a little more out in his life in the future, and you'll see it making more sense and how it shows up. What does end up happening is that when he is now living with his uncle, who is also poor, and he has his children as well that he's raising, you don't see any significant sort of close familiar, bonds. The only thing that we see is him basically when he takes in his younger cousin, Ali. He takes him in, and we see Ali basically having a lot of leaning towards him. He has a lot of loyalty towards him, and we see that generally in all the younger figures in this Islamic history, that they do have a strong, like a sort of, it's just like that's their tribal way. Like we are attached to this figure, like Zayd or any other character who is bonded to you at a young age. But Muhammad doesn't really develop that. If you notice, he doesn't really develop that sense of extreme like affiliation, extreme emotional attachment or bond, like this is my child, right? Like whatever anybody says, like it's, I am attached to it, and that's how I will behave. We will see that playing out as well, how that plays out. So you see that in a sense, like even if they are not family by immediate relationships, they're still a tribal family, they're still family by blood, and they value those connections. They very much value. They'll go to fight for you. They might disagree with a lot of it, but they will still stand with you. But in a sense, we never see that with like Muhammad and his family. It's kind of a question mark, actually. I feel like there's a lot of omission. There's a lot of stuff hidden. We don't really know what's going on here. Why does he actually never develop that extreme bond with his uncle, his grandfather, his whoever his like immediate tribe? We see that when he's of age, right, and they're like really trying to get him to do some like build his career, he ends up marrying a woman who is older than him, right? Now, how old, we can try to infer that, but there are a lot of like all these defenders and apologists and like weird people who'll be like, oh, she was over 40, she was 50, but like I might want to remind you that this woman had 6 children moving forward. So yeah, let's take some biology into consideration, right? Like, let's just not get carried away. And I think one of the reasons they like to get carried away is because they want to justify that, he was with an old, haggard woman, so now he's within his rights to marry a child. But we'll come to that, we'll come to that issue. So him marrying this older woman, right? Definitely older, like, someone, because his mother was also a young mother. So maybe you can say that she was maybe 30s or her late 30s. Maybe she was somewhere in that range, We can't really figure out exactly, but she might have been someone in that age group. And he felt that energy, like someone who was actually going to take care of him, right? We see that he does end up, that's how all the interactions are. He is scared when he starts hearing these voices or whatever, and they all plant all these ideas in him. When we see that sense of him running towards a woman, telling her to cover me up, like protect me, I'm scared, hide me, you see that you have an insight into their actual dynamics and their relationship, right? This is not a daddy and a child bride issue. This is a very different way where he sees you as an authority in something that you can protect him. Yet he respects you in a way. He respects your opinion. He does see you as someone capable, worthy. That's a very different dynamic in a marriage. And that's how it plays out. He does tell her, like, he's running towards her and he's telling her, help me, I'm scared. And she, as a soothing wife, plays out a very motherly, nurturing role by soothing him and saying, it's okay, it might be something else, let's figure it out, we'll deal with it, and that kind of relationship. Point to be noted is that Khadija here, the kind of mother that Khadija is like, this whole idea of, oh, it was the norm of they all send their children away to the desert, and the rich people, that's how they did it, and noble people, that's how they did it. Well, big reminder, Khadija doesn't do it. She doesn't do it with either of her children. She does raise her children. And I think Muhammad sees that. Muhammad sees what kind of mother Khadija is actually, and she is a very good mother. She is a very capable, very, there for her children, who enjoys actually motherhood, who plays with her children, holds them, hugs them. You get that sense by how she's also interacting with Muhammad, right? She's a very nurturing kind of personality here. And I think Muhammad does definitely see that. He sees a lot of that. And when you come to the future narratives where, he is thinking about his own mother, you can't help but notice like there's a very different distinction in how he, thinks about Khadija and how he thinks about his mother, right? He definitely sees his mother as abandoning him, right? Like that, there's that wound there. I think it's like a resentment, and he never really was able to work through that trauma. It's a big trauma. And you might say that, when he hears these voices, his other self, the speaking, Allah, he's trying to work out, like, he's like, I wanna forgive her. I wanna heal. I wanna move on. And that voice, angry voice, is saying, no, she didn't, she's in hell. It's almost like a split personality, these two personalities that are discussing. And here, this personality is telling him, his unable to work through that trauma. He also, that's exactly how he speaks about his father. There's a lot of anger and resentment of his father dying and, leaving him an orphan, leaving him to fend for himself. In a way, also leaving him poor. We will come to that, because I think the fact that he felt, you know, alone, no source, nothing. So you see that there's character that had to come out, this other self, this angry tribal thing. You can see where that comes out. It was like a very self-defense protection mechanism that's gonna come out. It's like a watchdog, because that's exactly how he describes Allah, like a watchdog. It's just like angry, ready to pounce. You all have to fight with me. It's my way or the highway. That's the kind of figure he's really needs, and he wants that out of himself, and that's what he is taking. That's what he takes charge and what leads him. If he had worked through that trauma, I think a lot of things would have been very different, especially with, it's a very heavy wound, having to be away or like broken, like that it's like a big breaking when you don't have that connection or that healing bond with your parents, even if they're not in this world, right? There's just this bond that you feel. You have goodwill, you have like a respect, you have gratitude for the things that they did. But we see that extremely lacking in Muhammad's life. We see that extremely lacking even with the following figures that come in his life, his parental figures. It's quite painful, as in a way that the last person who took care of him, his grandfather, he doesn't go to his funeral. In a way, that is his grandfather, right? Like the father of his father. He does not go to his funeral. He's angry with him. Then his uncle, right? His uncles, he's angry that he never converted. He's angry with basically Ali's father, who had raised him as well. He's angry that he doesn't follow his, he doesn't like, again, he feels that abandonment issue, rejection, that they should have just accepted what I'm saying, right? They should have followed me, and they didn't. Again, reenacting that abandonment, rejection scenario. And then we see also with like his other uncles who were still, powerful and helping him, Abu Jahl, and how he is very, very, like the extreme animosity that he has ends up having towards him, just because they do not accept his alter self, this Allah, this angry God, right? Like, agree with this disagreement. The whole disagreement really just leaving it like agreeing to disagree. This, which is a very important aspect of all communication and relationships, right? You must have that level of tolerance in order to carry out healthy relationships. He never seems to develop that. It's always like my way or the highway. And then that extremely alter self ego that comes out is very angry, very defensive, and cursing his relatives, really, at the end of the day. Now, how would that, like that kind of worldview, right? Like if you were, as a child, lacking that extreme protective, nurturing mother and father, right? Like what kind of world will you end up having? If you actually see some studies and psychological studies of children in a similar situation, they do have a very fear worldview. The world is unsafe. They always need protection. They're always looking for validation, always looking for, like, they need a lot of reassurance of your, like, that you're not going to leave, that you're going to be there, for your, like, pledging allegiance, right? Like, you are going to be there. Keep saying that. Remind me that you say that you are going to believe me, that that you love me, that you are, like, I'm very important to you. They need that validation constantly. And I think when you see how this religion plays out, you see exactly how Muhammad is placed square in the center of it, that he needs constant validation, constant reassurance, constant reminding that, we do accept you. You are the most important person. We love you more than anybody, like that constant extreme reassurance. When we reach to adulthood, right, like Muhammad and his now adopted son Zayd, right, like that, now we are reaching to adulthood. Zayd, of course, adores him. He has seen him He's willing to like follow him anywhere. He's been with him through a lot of thick and thin, right? Like when they go to Taif and a lot of places. He's seen him go through a lot of ups and downs and his wrestling and his own internal conflicts. Um, Imagine that kind of child, right? That child that has been with you, that you love, that you have essentially accepted. But we do see, like, I'm very curious to know what kind of relationship Zayd had with his father and what kind of relationship would Muhammad actually have with the son. You know, he sees that his son is now willing with him. Like that's the one thing that he loves about his son is how obedient he is to him. He follows him, right? He does everything he says. That seeking of constant validation from women, you know, we see that playing out a lot in Muhammad's life. We see that like he uses that as making like strong allegiance or like taking on that women or whatever, but he never really trusts any other person on the word of mouth. Like just like a tribal leader, he uses those relationships, even his own like best friend, like ride or die friends, right, that went with him to the cave, that were like at the mouth of like death. He still wants securing their allegiance through marriage. That's like some next level insecurity, right? That no, you say you're my best friend, I know you're my brother, you're this and that here and like, you know, everything, but I still have to secure it. It's not a real allegiance, even though I'm your prophet. You guys have, you know, said everything. You followed me through Makkah. You left your things, whatever, you know, they followed him through. This guy's still testing, you know, loyalty. He's like, well, I still have to marry your daughters. Like, you know, we still have to do that. He doesn't go that way. He's like, I need that security, so I'm going to take your daughter, right? So you wouldn't go around and turn around and just like go against me, basically. This really spells out a lot of insecurity. They want to call it Arabian culture, but come on, you know, Arabian culture, yeah, they also were very lustful, but they don't want to put that, you know, they don't want to attribute that to their very idea of Muhammad, but there's that too, right? There's definitely an element of lust. Coming back to the element of lust, this narrative is very questionable because that's exactly how God or Allah puts it in the verse. He's like, you kind of also thought she was attractive and you had feelings for her, which let's just be honest, let's call it lust, and he wanted her. It takes a lot of extreme like disassociation, right? You must have some level of, you must be okay with having the feeling of lust be more of a priority than your deep sense of family, right? Like your son. Because even if he was not your real son, but you grew up with him, there's this natural, like human, natural embarrassment, like extreme disgust. Like there's just a natural level of, you would put that, like, you don't need to say that. You didn't really need to even put it in a ruling or a word. Like naturally, who wants to go through that situation of having a father-in-law, a father figure, daughter figure, right? Especially if you were in those relationships as well. It's not just about age. You were kind of in those relationships. So it is extremely, extremely disturbing, even to the Arabs. Like, you know, people are like, that was a custom of, that was like not a big deal. Like that was a really disgusting thing even for them, you know. Just the fact that if you called someone, like even if you called your wife like, you're like my mother to me, they considered like it's such a huge insult. Like, I mean, she's your wife, you're married to her, but just referencing her as like, you are like my mother, you know, would like really endanger your relationship and actually could put you in a situation where that would break. It's a very weird tactic because that sense of regard or respect or like sacredness or element of like, of course, like, you know, the nature or of relationships, a hierarchy of relationships, they don't have that similar effect with father and daughter, right? The father and daughter relationship is really ambiguous here. He's like, yeah, no, I'm gonna marry her and I'm gonna wed her and I'm gonna bed her. So I just can't imagine that wedding, right? Like that wedding, the whole community is feeling icky. It's disgusted. He has previous wives who are also just as shocked and disgusted that, you know, Really? Like that's the really important lesson that God has to teach the world? Justify it. Like it was such an important lesson that God had to teach to the world of exactly who else can you marry, right? Having to overcome that extreme disgust culture, like breaking of this tradition of the sacred relationship of like, who wants to do that? Does any Muslim actually want to do that in today's day and age? Who wants to go and marry their ex-daughter-in-law, who is supposedly their adopted son, or their cousin, or their, who wants to do that? It's an extreme downgrade level of relationship and having that element of respect and sacredness in a relationship. It definitely downgrades it. Interesting psychological analysis if you want to see of how Muhammad sees everybody else who disagrees with him, right? Like Jahiliyyah and Jahil, right? Let's come back to that topic, Jahiliyyah. Now, of course, Jahiliyyah also was a word before Islam. People like to think like Jahiliyyah, of course, that's like the pre-Islam, the pre-Islamic. But like, come on, Arabic existed before Muhammad. Okay, he didn't invent Arabic. So that word existed definitely before time. And it was basically the equivalent of someone who was unsophisticated, uneducated, right? Uneducated was also part of that term. The specific term of being illiterate is ummi. But like, let me give you an Urdu example, like calling someone gawar, right? Gawar kind of also means unpar. Unpar is a more specific term of being illiterate, but gawar, you kind of have a sense of like, yeah, they're unsophisticated and uneducated. You kind of see that he really insults all these other people by calling them also illiterate and unsophisticated. But you forget that he's also that. You forget that Muhammad is just another illiterate person who never really wants to uplevel himself and starts like reading or getting an education or taking some notes or like lessons, right? He is very happy with his own, content with his own like alter ego speaking to him and giving him knowledge. All these remixed versions of like traditional old Arabian traditions and whatever, tidbits he's heard, that's enough for him to, consider himself as like a very awakened and scholarly and enlightened person. Let's just look at that term, like, the insult he uses to call other people is jahil. Really, it reveals a lot about what he actually thinks about himself, right? Like that is what he thought about himself. That is what he thought God was telling him. This God who knew everything about him. He's like, read. But he's like, if his God was saying recite, he would have just recited, right? Like, does he not know what that word means either? But he knows. And he's clarifying that I can't read. But like, you must remember, Angel Jibrail here is not holding up a book and saying read, right? That's not what he's doing. He's not holding up some tablets or some, floating verses or anything. He's simply asking him to read. And he says, no, I don't know how to read. I don't know how to read. So insecurities of Muhammad as well about the fact that he doesn't actually know how to read, that is aware of the fact that he does not know how to read. That's another point to be noted. He chooses to remain illiterate. This religion or this new enlightenment doesn't bring the knowledge of literacy to him. He wants to preserve, and he in fact leaves his children illiterate as well. I want to also say how Muhammad was as a father. We don't really have too many stories about his daughters describing, we don't have that like whole collection of hadiths of what kind of father he was or anything about that sense. We only end up knowing is how this father basically did end up using his daughters' marriages as well to his convenience and his furthering his agenda. Defying alliances, which is basically with Osman, he ends up marrying two of his daughters. I mean, that's also a sad situation, right? Like his daughters all end up dying early. Just tells me that they basically weren't very well taken care of, right? These daughters had a hard life due to their father. Their father not only wanted to be a prophet, all right, let's just be clear about that. Like Muhammad, yes, wanted that recognition to be a prophet, but he also essentially wanted to be a ruler. All his actions and his agenda and his plans and his alter ego was also wanting him to be a king in a way, or a tribal leader, or the next ruler. And that's kind of what he sets out to do. So analyze this as a man who wanted a with an ambition to gain a lot of recognition and validation, and in a sense redeem his like that sense of abandonment, right? Like, so with these points, I'm going to end this video here. I'm going to give you some time to think about, as much as Muhammad likes to talk about himself as a man, if we were actually to take him and analyze and look at his life story as a real person, what kind of issues, just like anybody else, growing up issues, parents, relationships, friendships, how does it actually play out? And a lot of the anger and resentment, the grudges that show up in his personality, how, and of course, as an extension, shows up in Quran and as an aspect of Allah, right? Like Allah is also very grudging, sort of fickle. He's also very moody. So we see a lot of those aspects also playing out in Allah. And I think that's a very good room to discuss and really analyze for people who want to think about how Muhammad's whole personality actually plays out. So with that, I'm going to end this video here, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.